Hi sir, hi classmates. So for today, we will talk about the concepts of the cell theory. So what is the cell theory? The cell theory is one of the most important benefits of biology, and practically everything we learn in science class relates back to it. But what is the cell theory? For today, we will going to clear the cell theory definition, explain key dates in the history of the theory, and explain why it's so very important to understand. So let's talk about the cell theory definition. Number 1, all living things are made up of a cell. Number 2, cells are the basic building blocks of life. And number 3, all cells come from pre-existing cells created through the process of cell division. So as science evolved, 3 more components were added to the theory. Some biology classes don't require us to know these parts of the cell theory because they weren't part of the original definition. But it's still useful to be aware of them. So number 4, it says that energy flow occurs within cells. Number 5, hereditary information is passed from the cell to cell. And number 6, all cells have the same basic chemical composition. So, what are cells? The literal definition is a cell is a group of organelles surrounded by a thin membrane. The cell theory definition states that cells are the building blocks of life. Cells both make up all living things and run the processes needed for life. For example, our hair, our skins, our organs, and other parts of our bodies are all made up of cells. So in fact, each person is estimated to be made up of nearly 40 trillion cells. So each part of a cell has a different function, and your cells are responsible for taking in nutrients, turning to nutrients into energy, removing waste, and more. So basically, everything our body does, it does because cells are directing the actions. So the third part, cell of the cells theory definitions states that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So this means that cells don't just appear out of a thin air, known as spontaneous generation. So when we say spontaneous generation, it says that new cells are always made up from current cells. This means that all current life on the planet is descended from the very first cells, which first made an appearance on Earth roughly 3.5 billion years ago. So cells have been replicating themselves continuously ever since. So, and what does the newer part of the cell theory states? So part 4 refers the fact that in all living things, energy is continuously transformed from one type to another. Examples of these processes include photosynthesis, where plant cells convert light energy into chemical energy, and cellular respiration, where both plants and animal plants convert glucose into energy. So part 5 refers to DNA and the fact it is passed from parent cell to child cell. So finally, part 6 of the cell theory tells us that all cells are made up of the same chemicals, water, inorganic ions, and organic molecules. So, let's move on and let's talk about the history of the cell theory. So the cell theory and ideas about cells and living things evolved over several centuries. So here are the key dates for the cell theory. In 1665, Robert Hooke is the first person to be observed cells when he looks at the slice of a cork in a microscope. In 1665, Francisco Redi disproves spontaneous generation by showing maggots will only grow on uncovered meat, not meat enclosed in a jar. His work later contributes to part 3 of the cell theory. So, in 1670s, Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch scientist, begins his work developing better microscopes that allow scientists to see cells and the organelles they contain more clearly. So in 1839, German scientists Matthias and Theodor describes the first two parts of the cell theory. So Matthias stated that all plants are made up of cells, while Theodor stated that all animals are made up of cells. So Matthias and Theodor are generally credited as the developers of the cell theory. So lastly, 1855, Rudolf Virchow, another German scientist, described the third part of the cell theory, which is that all cells come from existing cells. Since then, microscopes have continued to become more and more refined, making it possible to study cells even more closely and allowing scientists to expand on the original cell theory. So, how is the cell theory important for biology? It is one of the fundamental principle of biology, and it's so important that it has been information many of us take for granted. So knowing that all living things are made up of cells allows us to understand how organisms are created, grow, and die. That information helps us understand how new life is created, why organisms take the form they do, how cancers spread, how diseases can be managed, and more. So cells even help us understand fundamental issues such as life and death, and organisms whose cells are living is considered alive, while one cell whose cells are dead is considered dead. So before the cell theory existed, people had a very different view of biology. Many believed in spontaneous generation, the idea that living organisms can arise from non-living matter. An example of this would be a piece of rotten meat creating flies, because flies often appear around rotten meat. So additionally, before cells and the cell theory were known, it wasn't understood that humans as well as other living organisms were made up of billions and trillions of tiny building blocks and controlled all our biology processes. This is how organisms grow, and death were much more of a mystery compared to what we know today. The cell theory fundamentally changed how we look at life. So that's all. Thank you.